Mr. Deitch, who is Banksy?
Well, so some people say, oh, Banksy, I'm convinced Mr. Brainwash is Banksy.
Exactly.
Okay, some people are convinced that his former art dealer, Steve Lazaridis, they say, now I know, Steve Lazaridis is Banksy. Other people think Damien Hirst is Banksy.
Right.
Yeah, that it's so successful, only Damien Hirst could be producing this. But I've never met Banksy. I did this whole project with him in Art in the Streets. I never asked to meet him. He arranged, so when supposedly he did come to the museum, it was 3 in the morning, the security cameras were turned off, went through a back door so he could do this on his own. But I'm not sure if it was actually Banksy or people he directed who came. But I have had a very stimulating email correspondence with him, and a very thoughtful person, a formidable intellect. He's one of the most brilliant people have made innovative art in the past decade. He's a very, very significant artist.
You got to meet a lot of amazing, talented artists. You were talking about Andy Warhol. How was he? What do you recall about him?
The public Andy Warhol was significantly different from the private Andy Warhol. So the public Andy Warhol, as we all know, spoke in monosyllables, was distant, didn't seem to be personally engaged. But the private Andy Warhol was one of the most generous friends, the most amusing raconteur, conversationalist of his time. He had experienced a more interesting life than almost anybody else in progressive art and culture. And who else knew both Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground and President Reagan? It was a remarkable life, and he talked about it all with amusement and insight.
And so you were friends with him for a long time?
Well, I began getting engaged in conversation with him in the early 80s. We went to Hong Kong in 1982, and that's when the relationship began. Unfortunately, he died prematurely.
Do you recall
those 5 years or so was a remarkable time.
Do you have any anecdotes with Andy Warhol, like some amazing, something that may have happened that was fun or surprising to you? Any experience?
Well, when my first insight into Andy as a private person came when I picked up him and his whole entourage at the airport in Hong Kong when we invited him for this project. And Fred Hughes, his manager, had cleverly, as part of the negotiation, arranged for the entire entourage to come, paid for by the Chinese entrepreneur. And so they took over the whole first class section of a Pan Am Clipper coming from New York to Hong Kong. And I picked them up in a small fleet of Rolls Royces provided by the Mandarin Hotel. And we went to the club that was owned by the sponsor of the trip. And part of the reason was to inaugurate this club. And so the entire Warhol entourage sits down around a large traditional Chinese table with a big lazy Susan that could accommodate 15 or more people. And there, in the comfort of his group, Andy just started to talk. And prior to that, I only heard him say, gee, and wow. And they were gossiping about all their friends, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I didn't even realize he was capable of speaking in sentences. So Well, that was the beginning of my understanding a lot more about Andy Warhol.
So he had a public persona that was very different from his private persona.
Right. But slowly that private persona was revealed through his autobiography, the books that he talked out through his dialogues with Pat Hackett.
And during your career, you also, with Deitch projects, you became the exclusive representative of Keith Haring's estate, yeah?
That's right.
And how was that experience?
Well, so Keith was one of my good friends in the early 80s. I met him when he was working as a bartender for Tony Shafrazi at one of Tony's parties. Tony didn't represent him yet, and Tony didn't really even know who he was. You know, he was just treating him as one of the hired help. But Keith, at that time, had this fascinating art venture where he would invite other artists to paint his eyeglasses.
To paint his eyeglasses?
Yeah, and Keith at that time was everywhere. You know, he was at every party, club. So this was one of the most effective art platforms in the entire New York art world, because everybody saw Keith's eyeglasses. So he would invite Kenny Sharp to paint them and other artists. And so I saw this guy with a kind of geeky look, short hair, and these crazy glasses. And I went to talk to him. And that's how we established our rapport. When I talked to him behind the table at this party. And then we began doing a number of things together. And in 1982, when he became represented by Tony Shafrazi, Tony was putting together a book to accompany his first Keith Haring show. And I was part of the group that produced this book. So Dan Friedman was the designer, and I wrote the main essay. And Keith loved the essay, and he couldn't believe that I hadn't talked to him beforehand to sort of get all the ideas of what to say, that somehow what I had written was so in sync with what he was thinking. And so that established our friendship and rapport. And we hung out together a lot and always had a dialogue. At the time, I didn't have a gallery or the means to actually produce works of his. You know, it was more just a dialogue, introducing him to people, and I connected him with collectors and others. And then I wrote a second essay on Keith for an exhibition of his work at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam around 1985. And continued to be very friendly with Keith until he also died prematurely. And so it was an irony that, that I ended up for a brief period working in partnership with Sotheby's that had bought the Andre Emmerich Gallery, represented Keith's estate, and it was an unlikely combination, the gallery that represented the estate of Morris Louis and Hans Hofmann to represent Keith's estate, but that's what happened. And it was just this irony of fate that myself, who was very close to Keith, knew the work very well, ended up walking into the situation and taking over the formal representation of Keith's estate when the Andre Emmerich Gallery dissolved.
It was in the early 80s, yeah?
No, this was 1998.
98. Okay.
97, 98.
How was Keith Haring? So I guess...
Keith was a genius. And so he had this completely remarkable ability, very few artists have, to have this unfiltered ability to imagine imagery in his head, and it just went through his body without any constraint. And he was able to put down on paper or canvas or on a wall exactly what he was feeling, what he was imagining.
Like a catalyst. It was like a catalyst.
And well, and you can make an analogy to a great jazz musician.
Yeah.
Somebody who, without any score, can just stand up in front of an audience and play a brilliant 10-minute saxophone solo. Just what's invented in the mind goes through the body and extends through the musical instrument. And so Keith's body was like a musical instrument. He made art with it. The analogy of his body and a musical instrument was fairly accurate because he always had a boombox playing with dance music, and he moved in a dance-like rhythm.
Yeah, so he
It
was.
was an incredible launch, and when Keith was doing the public work, he always drew an audience, people who were watching, who were dancing with him. It was always a remarkable spectacle. He would start at the upper left corner of a wall and just move across it over the course of an hour or two and complete the whole thing in a perfectly balanced, perfectly rhythmic composition.
So did you have, of course, you launched a lot of emerging artists. So what do you think are the main attributes to detect talent in an artist, especially nowadays? I mean, and then also if talent is enough in order to make it in the art business?
I think there's a common misconception about artists that it is about being able to craft a painting or sculpture very well, and that art is an extension of craft. But as you get involved with art, you realize that art is one of the most important intellectual disciplines. Art is like philosophy. It's that if you don't have this intellectual content, your work then becomes simply craft or decoration. But the great artists, they create new paradigms of perception, new intellectual frameworks that inspire us to perceive the world in a different way.
So they have to have a vision too. Yeah,
Absolutely, it's an inner vision.
Mm-hmm.
So, as this is more and more understood, the conceptual art becomes increasingly appreciated. So, let's say there's an artist like Joseph Cassuth, who's well known in Italy.
Yeah.
So, when he conceives of a work of art as a reproduction of a dictionary definition, I saw a wonderful work of his that was the dictionary definition of nothing. It was white type on a black canvas, and it's on exhibit now in Los Angeles in a show here, and brilliant work. So at first people are confounded because where's the craft? Well, in fact, Joseph Cassuth is one of the greatest graphic designers of our time, and in fact there is immense craft because he's just an absolute brilliant designer, use of typeface, and really created something. But it was hard for people to appreciate that when they just see, is that art? He's just taken a dictionary definition and blown it up in a photostat. But Joseph, of course, was a very profound philosopher.
Yes.
So my reference points are artists who fused a philosophical approach to art, who opened up new definitions of what an artist is, but also infused everything they did with humor and humanity. So I like artists where the work also amuses you. So certainly Duchamp and Man Ray are in that category.
In that category. What are your favorite ones? Of course, you like, let's say, the 3 top ones that you really appreciate right now.
Well, there's a historic foundation. So I love the artists who come out of Dada and prefigure a performative and conceptual approach to art. So Duchamp, Baccabbia, Man Ray, that's very much my foundation.
And then, of course, street art. I saw your wonderful exhibition at the MoCA Art in the Streets. Wonderfully great and beautiful. So what is the relevance of street art nowadays?
Well, art always needs to be brought back to life and reality. Is that art has a tendency to become academic and to turn in on itself. So it's not nothing wrong with that. That it's sometimes it becomes at the end of a movement a little excessive, and so the art becomes sometimes very dry and academic. And so art continues to renew itself, and artists are always coming up with something that freshens it, that connects it with what's really going on in life.